Rashid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayan. Thank you very much. So, welcome everyone to this accounting design project virtual events. And I think this is the second session of this semester. And my name is Shichen and I come from University of Bristol. And today I'm very happy to moderate the session. So we're going to have two very excellent paper and exciting paper to discuss. And the first paper is about consolidated or standalone earnings. Which one do investors react to? Which is from Sid from University of Illinois, Chicago. He's an associate professor and his research interest in shareholder value management. And we've got a second paper from Patrick, which is from Maastricht University, and he's going to tell us about the informativeness of balance sheet disaggregation, evidence for forecasting operating asset. Just before officially starting, let me briefly talk about a few housekeeping guidelines. So firstly, please mute your microphone during the presentation to avoid potential background noise. And if you do feel comfortable, please turn on your camera so that we can see each other. And in order to ask questions, you can either raise your hand by typing in the chat box, or you can just use the raise hand function from the participant list, and then I will jump in and call the participants in order and allows you to ask your question. And Sid has just agreed with me that the first 5 minutes will be uninterrupted in the presentation. Let him finish, and then the last minute as well. And during the period, we're going to ask a question, jump in. And to allow the others to ask questions, we might limit the number of follow-up questions one can ask in one interaction. And if the time does not permit, you can always enter your thought in the chat box, and then send the email to the speaker or later. And my role today actually is keep up the schedule, so I will try to keep track of the time. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome the first speaker from Sid, University of Illinois, Chicago. He's going to tell us about consolidated or standalone earnings. What do investors react to? Sid, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ayung and Stephen and the Accounting Design Project for inviting us to come share this paper. We are just preparing ourselves to do a complete revision of this paper, so your comments couldn't come at a better time. We will really, Sumit's here and Sudarshan is here, two of my co-authors. And they're both keeping close tabs on what the comments are, and we'll take that into our thinking into the next revision of the paper. So thank you very much. Let's get started. Okay, so the paper talks about two sets of earnings numbers: consolidated earnings and standalone earnings. Historically in India, standalone earnings were the only earnings that firms were required to disclose. Standalone earnings are the earnings of the parent company, and using the equity method, the earnings of subsidiaries. Right? Under the old standard, firms reported this set of earnings numbers and also presented a balance sheet along the same standalone basis. And subsequent to that, the unconsolidated subs financials were released separately. Starting in 2002, really, full set of rules went into effect that required, disclosure of a, fully consolidated set of financial statements. But the regulators said that they would like the firms to release both a full set of consolidated statements and a set of standalone statements. So that's the setting that we're working in. The norm in the world is, or at least it seems to be the norm around the world, is that full consolidation is typically what is observed and what is presented. In India, of course, the rules are a little bit unique, and we'll talk a little bit about the why those rules went into effect and why they changed, but it really had to do with post-liberalization in the country. The country was trying to open itself up to more foreign direct investment, and they wanted to be providing financial statements that were more closely aligned with what's found in the rest of the world to make it easier for investors around the world to understand what's going on in an Indian firm. The question then that we're going to ask is, given that the global standard is full consolidation, um, what's the need for the extra financial statements? What's the need for the additional standalone statements, right? In talking about this paper with executives in India, I recently had a chance to speak with the founder of a big IT company called Cognizant Technologies, and he was really, quite negative about the regulators and saying they really don't understand that when they just keep adding one rule after the next and don't take anything away, it adds a lot of extra cost, it adds a lot of extra bureaucracy, and we're not really clear about whether we're getting any better information. So that was kind of, it's consistent with some of the themes that we're trying to explore in the paper. One of the questions that we might ask in the setting is, does having two sets of financial statements create unnecessary confusion? Does it provide, additional information? What's the role of this extra information? All right. So our question, we brought it down simply to say, how does the market incorporate consolidated and standalone earnings information in determining stock prices? There's a few different counter arguments that are playing out throughout the paper. One of them is that there's both theory and empirical work talking about consolidated statements being comprehensive and subsuming all the information necessary. At the same time, there's theory that says any process of aggregation leaves something out, and so you do lose information, and that information could be valuable. There's also the process of consolidation and the role of things like intercompany transactions and how they could potentially introduce noise into a world where both consolidated and standalone information is out there. So the presence of this noise doesn't make it a slam dunk that standalone information is necessarily incrementally informative. What we find when we actually look at our results is that the market doesn't fixate purely on consolidated earnings. There is incremental information in the standalone information. The market differentially prices the earnings from standalone to the earnings from the rest of the subsidiaries, and particularly in environments where you would anticipate that monitoring might be weak, where the risk of expropriation might be high, where the quality of earnings might be poor, the weight given to standalone earnings in determining prices is higher. So overall, what we find is that there's value in both standalone and consolidated statements. Now, what I said to Shi is, I think in the first 5 minutes I can get through preview the results and the basic setup of the questions. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm willing to take questions now. And while you're coming in with questions, let me share this example with you. That was an example that we thought about as a good way to think about why this paper matters. Here are two major technology companies in India. One is HCL Technologies, the other is Mphasis. And this was what was released in the year 2019. So in the year 2019, they released earnings per share of 56 rupees and 5 paisa for Mphasis and 73 rupees and 58 paisa for HCL. That represented a growth in EPS of about 13.39 rupees for Mphasis and 11.35 rupees for HCL. If you form deciles of earnings surprises during the year 2019, both of these companies are in the same earnings decile. Right? Now, when you actually get the financial statements, what you actually get is this. You actually get these two sets of numbers. So you get the total consolidated numbers, which I just showed previously, but you also get that the parent or the standalone financials delivered earnings of 249 for emphasis and 715 for HCL. And so just, simple subtraction, you could impute that the subsidiaries' earnings were these. Well, what's the story it tells? Story it tells is that much of the earnings surprise here is coming from the subsidiary, while much of the earnings surprise is coming from the parent here for HCL. And so, our question, these two sets of numbers are out there. We can do some very, very simple mathematics to think about what the implications are for where the earnings are coming from. And at that point, we have to ask, should these be viewed the same? Should they be viewed differently? Does it matter that one of them is generating its earnings from, through the parent, and the other is generating its earnings through the subsidiary? So that was sort of the general question. Okay, got a couple of hands up. Shi, you want to go ahead? And then
I guess Trevor is first. You can go
yeah,
first.
go ahead. No worries. Okay.
So Sid, as I mentioned to you in an email, we did a lot of analysis on Japan many years ago. It's Masako and I. But you may have alluded to this that I didn't internalize. But how much? The degree of subsidiaries, the nature of the subsidiaries, the relationship between them, and there are a lot of institutional aspects that looking at it in aggregate doesn't really reveal much. And some of it is the amount of information, but also, minority share. I know you talked about equity accounting and minority shares and things like that, but the composition of which subsidiaries they are and what kind of business they're doing can make a huge difference to the inferences you can make. So I don't know how much you are able to control, especially for large consolidated groups. I mean, with one subsidiary, it's fine or easier, but with multiple subsidiaries, it's very difficult.
Yeah. So let me mention a couple of things. First of all, Trevor, thank you for sending that over. We were not aware of it, and we should have been. So when I saw the paper, I had two reactions. One, I was very happy because you and Masako thought looking at this level of aggregation and disaggregation was very important in another case, and that made me feel that we were on a good track. At the same time, I know that also likely means that some of the thunder that we're trying to bring out in the paper might have already been taken. So anyway,
no, I didn't mean it in that way. The point more was that we spent a lot of time trying to understand these idiosyncratic issues and the institutional issues to be able to sort it out. And so that's really the question is how much is there a lot of idiosyncratic?
There is both systematic cross-sectional variation and some idiosyncratic pieces that we've been trying our best to look into. How much of that we've already gotten together, it's again, we don't want to turn this into a series of case studies, but we did, I can jump to it right away, or if you'll just give me a few minutes, we'll get to it in course. But there are definitely, a lot of the cross-sectional work that we've done with respect to, you pointed out, what's, the range in, for example, the number of subsidiaries you have, right? And we actually find pretty striking differences in how much the earnings of the parent play a role in pricing when you have more than the median number of subsidiaries in the economy versus less. Related party transactions, I'm sure that's huge in Japan as well as it is here. We look very carefully at not only the magnitude of related party transactions overall, but the types of related party transactions that could be used to either prop up earnings or the type of related party transactions that could be used to tunnel, expropriate, all the pieces that you would be concerned about when there's RPTs. So we've done a good bit of, at least from what we can, measure, going after them in the cross section. And, we've included in the paper several good, sort of anecdotes that sort of try to drive some of the same points home. So I hope that's a good start to answering your question.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Stephen?
Please.
Yes, so there's one point here on what you have on the screen at the moment. You've got the group's earnings per share. You got the parent, so you're deducting. So this is what the subsidiaries are reporting, but they're going to be reporting more than that if they've got intercompany transactions, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. 100%. So this is a gross simplification. It's sort of what we can do looking from the outside as a first order approximation. One of the things that we talk about a lot in the paper is sort of the noise that intercompany transactions introduce. So if I might, sorry. In terms of why these standalone statements might not be useful in the presence of consolidated statements, a lot of it has to do with the fact that that you may not have both the measure of the standalone and the measure of the income from the consolidated from the subsidiary are affected by intercompany transactions, right? So if you have the standalone, right, you may not actually be getting what the real standalone's earnings are, and you may also not be getting what the real consolidated earnings are. I mean, in the process of consolidation, these errors cancel each other out, but it noises up the metric at the disaggregated level, which then diminishes the usefulness of the metric, right? So I would absolutely agree with that. Ayun?
I said, I have a related question to this slide you jumped to. So like those theories, when they developed their models, they did not incorporate the historical kind of the background in India. So that at the beginning, you talk about like it started from standalone parent financial statement.
Right.
And then added the consolidated, right? But like when they actually develop the model to actually have a horse race, they don't have that sequence. They kind of have these two things falling from the sky, and then they start compare. So my question is, usually when the firms already have done the standalone parent reporting for many years, and then later on they have to do the consolidation by canceling out in kind of like inter-firm transactions. Can you see over time they are getting better at it by reducing more noise? Because right now you have cross-sectional analysis, but I would like to see a time trend.
See what happens time trend as we go forward.
Over time, right? Because I think a lot of your cross-sectional analysis, like number of subsidiaries, all those things are related to the noise, but we believe
absolutely, I mean, I think this is really, I mean, it wasn't the direction we started the paper in, but I think it's a great idea. I mean, Sumit, Sudarshan, if we think about, for example, whether the change in standard now leads to potentially over time less related party transactions because they're a little bit more visible at this point, or maybe decreases in discretionary accruals because you can't just use subsidiary discretionary accruals to prop up the standalone parent. I think these are definitely great directions for us to be thinking about and taking it forward. I'm not sure how much of that fits within the sort of the current research question, but definitely it also plays into there's a nice literature which I know one of Patrick's colleagues has been involved in where they look at the role of aggregated and disaggregated information in multinational corporations in the debt markets, right? And there too, they sort of start with sort of is it informative to credit risk and credit default swaps? And then they kind of migrate into, does does, over time, does it change the extent of earnings management that takes place and things like that through the subsidiaries? So yeah, absolutely. I think that that's something that we have, it's a very rich setting that we can take in a bunch of different directions. And we definitely think that that's something we want to do. She, did you have a question, or are you raising one? Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a very quick question. So,
Yeah.
so the first quick question is, so those subsidiaries that you're talking about, they, from my understanding, should be private companies, right? So the market and the second question related to that will be, there are two components in that difference. The one could be, as what you said, mentioned interrelated transactions, and secondly could also be the market react to the performance of the subsidiary itself. So which one of there will be two things that are happening here. So which one in your mind that is mostly referring to? Is that transaction or subsidiary most of? Yeah.
Okay, so let me go back. I think, Sumit, I'm not sure if it's in the current version of the paper, but I'm sure we've looked at it. There are subsidiaries that are actually publicly listed as well, and we've looked at what happens when you look only when there's private subsidiaries and when there's public. Sumit, can you remind us briefly what we saw there?
Yeah. So we have seen that. So if I can mention brief descriptive statistics of that, the maximum number of subsidiaries which are publicly listed for a particular firm is 10, but majority of companies have private subsidiaries which are not publicly listed. So there's greater amount of opacity when it comes to information at those levels. And we have also seen that if cross-sectionally, if we come up with a company where we have at least one privately listed subsidiary versus the firms which do not have any listed subsidiaries, we find the value of standalone statements more when there is more opacity, which kind of lines up with what Professor Sid would talk about when we go to the cross-sectional tests.
Right. So, by the way, just a brief discussion about terminology. Similar to what they would do in the UK, what we call a publicly traded company in America is called a privately listed company. So when Sumit said, when we look at firms that don't have any of those, that's where you actually see the role of standalone to be more predominant. That's just making sure everyone has the translation right on that. Right. So, but did we get at your question, or is there more?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, but in terms of Trevor, back to what you asked about, the mean is 9 subsidiaries, and roughly the subsidiaries have about 20% of the total assets, right? Obviously there's there's some decent level of variation in there. The interquartile ranges from 3% to about 30%. Subsidiaries are definitely not, the majority, but they're a good portion of it. When we actually look at the differences, what we know is that typically the parent ends up being more profitable, and on average, you're going to see more discretionary accruals, more earnings volatility, and more leverage in the subsidiaries, right? And that kind of, if I can go back to for example, what some of the executives that we've talked to are telling us, right? They point to a good bit of this, right? They say that particularly when it comes to evaluating things like the overall capital structure, you need to be looking at the full consolidated, and you need to be looking at the extent of leverage that sits in the subsidiaries, right? It's also a concern because leverage is often, a method of expropriation in these types of settings. So, go ahead, Trevor.
Yeah, just one more point is, in Japan we had the keiretsu situation, which complicated everything.
Right.
In my understanding is in India you have a lot of those relationships. And you talked about the interrelated parties, but so, and that creates opportunities, let's say, to manage all sorts of things. But the other dimension, which may or may not be helpful, but is the international component. I'm not sure, there are some very well-known Indian companies that have very big international operations. And then you are going to have standalone subsidiaries and a lot of other things. So, anyway, that, as I was saying, there are lots of nuances to these things, most of which we can't control. But
no, absolutely. But, at least to some extent, we might be able to get a sense. I don't know how easy it is coded up in the data. We can look at it just from our knowledge of the companies. But, kairetsus, in Japan are huge, family-owned businesses. Many of these are very large, and the family often stays engaged even after leaving active management through owning the minority piece of the firm. Or we might want to also look at which of these firms have sort of multiple classes of shares, because typically, when a family business goes public, there's a separate class of shares called founder shares. So those might be methods that we could use to start really thinking through those dynamics as well. So it's a very rich setting. Okay, so again, so briefly from a theory perspective, there's theory that says, the consolidated is useful in the presence of intercompany transactions because it offsets the errors. There's other theory that says the consolidated is useful because if you have a series of independent financials, agents can cherry pick, the sub part of the world that they want to use to justify things like their compensation. And then if you live in or think of a world where there is some degree of cost to processing information, the older standard likely to be challenging to implement, right? If information processing was completely free, you might say, okay, just give everybody, as long as the details of the subsidiaries financials are there, you should be just as well off under the old regime as the new regime. But under the old regime, you have organizations like Tata Steel, where what that means is that they're going to be releasing 287 balance sheets subsequent to releasing the parent company's financials. And how quickly and how easily can that be processed to reach some sense of consensus about what the company's actual performance is. I think it makes it challenging. At the same time, there is information lost, so providing more information is better than less. In thinking about this paper, I went back to a discussion that I had. I used to be, when I was an MBA student, TA for Al Rappaport, and he was writing his book on creating shareholder value. And he had an appendix in the book which talked about financial reporting. And essentially, he described all of financial reporting as essentially a process of aggregation, right? And he kind of presented a vision of a world where what firms would do is provide a database of transactions. So instead of a balance sheet, income statement, and a cash flow statement, they would provide a database of transactions. And then there would be an information system on top of it where you could, through parameters, select the type of accounting you want to overlay onto those transactions, generate whatever sets of financial statements you want yourself, right? If he was, again, sort of taking the theory and saying, if information, in a world where our tech systems are robust enough, this is what you should be able to do, and this is actually how financial reporting should change, right? I don't think we're necessarily in our setting arguing for a change, but that idea is always sort of in the back of my mind as we think about this paper, which is that thinking about what are the trade-offs and whether there is potentially an optimal amount of disaggregation or aggregation that needs to be provided in a given setting, right? So, with that, we know that when we aggregate, we lose data. We also know that if we have at least some of the data that we have, we could pick up behaviors that we weren't able to pick up earlier, right? There's an example we give in the paper from Bollywood, where Z Telefilms sells one of its catalogs to one of its subsidiaries, right? So when Z Telefilms financials are released at the parent level, it shows significant growth in earnings. And then later, when the subsidiaries financials are released, what we find is that those earnings were essentially the result of one intercompany transaction where this catalog was sold to a subsidiary. And the nature of the numbers were similar to the kind of numbers that Enron had when they sold barges to their subsidiaries in Africa. So, so definitely, maybe the Rappaport world is overload. We don't have necessarily the processing systems to handle that, but at the same time, maybe fully consolidated is too much, right? I mean, that's kind of what's in the background here. Yeah, Derek?
Hey, thanks for presenting today. Really interesting. Have you thought as a team about how having standalone financial statements can tell investors something about the spread or distribution of earnings? So like when I think about subsidiaries and parents, a lot of times it's helpful to think about whether or not you're diversifying risk as a company. And it seems like if you're just getting parent earnings, you're not really able to see that. But if you see the standalone earnings, you can see how they co-vary, and particularly if they co-vary in opposite directions. So it might tell you something about, is there a wide spread in the potential earnings of the parents if they have this high earnings, or is it really relatively consolidated to like a narrow distribution because of sort of negative correlations among the subsidiaries?
Yeah, we hadn't really thought about it in the sense of, is this providing some sort of risk management? But it's an interesting idea. I guess the only thing I wonder about there is that, you could get potentially the same effect by being diversified in all wholly owned subsidiaries. So you could be having that among the entities that constitute the parent, right? Because anything that's wholly owned is in the parent, right? So would be tricky to get into and unpack. I mean, it's easy enough just to run the correlation over time of the earnings of the parent to the subsidiary, right? To get a sense of if at that level, is this being used to potentially manage earnings or smooth, right? Beyond that, I'm not sure what we can do to get at further, risk management activities and diversification choices the firm has made internally. I mean, you might be able to just try to look a little bit at, whether they do provide, data on some of their segments, right? Which, by the way, as we've looked at it, one of the thoughts we had was, is what we're seeing really just picking up segment reporting? And it turns out it's not. It's what we observe is what you're really only going to see when firms don't provide segment reports. So, sorry, Kenneth?
Yeah, thank you. I had just a question here about Indian accounting. I mean, how do the performance of subsidiaries show up in the parent company? I mean, there must be some kind of accounting for the shareholdings in the subsidiaries. They must have a value on the asset side.
Right.
And there must be at least dividends coming to the parent company. And perhaps they are accounted for in some other way. So it's just a clarifying question here, because, I mean, the parent company also has earnings, financial income, typically from the subsidiaries.
Yeah.
So there is some kind of information here in the parent entity about the shareholdings that the company owns. So
Correct.
just if you could clarify that.
Yeah, Sudarshan, you're probably the closest to this of all of us. Sudarshan has worked with the Institute of Chartered Accountants and has been part of some of the policymaking discussions. So I'm going to ask if he could jump in here. I mean, the short answer is, parents' numbers reflect the performance of subsidiaries through the equity method, but I'm sure it's much deeper than that, and he can probably give us a lot more detail.
Hi, from the regulation point of view, yes, the consolidation financial reports do reflect some of the standalone information. But what we argued is, when they net it off in terms of the accounting treatment, so they get cancelled out against each other. It's like a more of a reflecting in the subsidiary and again consolidation, again going back. So when it comes to net numbers, consolidation and at a subsidiary level, they get negated.
Right. So if we think about the combination of, if we think about just looking at the standalone financials, right? The combination of the fact that you're using the equity method and that there's the presence of intercompany transactions, it suggests, essentially that you're going to get some noise in what you say is the parent's earnings, right? It could be overstated, it could be understated, depending on what the nature of the intercompany transactions are. For a given percentage of the parents holding equity in the subsidiary, right? And as Sudarshan said, then the advantage of consolidation there is that that also, whichever error you get in the parent, you get the offsetting error in the subsidiaries, and then when you put them all together, the errors cancel out.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So that's always, when we initially thought about, the question of, well, should the parents, let me actually just quickly go to this regression. So, if we, this is buy and hold returns in the long window on the left-hand side, and earnings surprises at the consolidated level for the parent entity and for the subsidiaries. If you look at it and you look at this column where we look at whether the disclosure of the parent's earnings is incremental to what you get in the consolidated, you find that it is, right? When we initially thought about this, we thought, well, shouldn't this always happen, right? Isn't more information always better? Isn't, doesn't the Blackwell theorem apply? If you have more information, if it's not useful, you can always throw it away, but that's where the challenge and the issue of these intercompany transactions and how they introduce noise into the process, come into play, because essentially this number is a number that's measured with noise. This number is a number that's measured with noise, and the noise cancels out when you get to here, right? So it's not a slam dunk that you're going to get, incremental information from the parent's number because of the presence of the intercompany transactions, but that's what we do get.
Hi, Sid. I guess you have 7 minutes. So
oh boy.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I can basically share with you, this is the first of the results, and essentially what this says is that the market does have incremental weight. In other words, consolidation doesn't give you necessarily all the information that the market is using. We find when we look at it just split between parent and subsidiary, that more of the weight goes to the subsidiary. I'm sorry, to the parent. Right, Kent, you had a question about this, or please? You're muted, sir.
Sorry, just a question with regard to your regressions here.
Yeah.
I mean, the marginal contribution here to the R-squares, if you include either consolidated or entity-specific it's very small. I mean, it's 13.2 to 13.3.
Agreed.
So is that really anything to write home about?
I don't know. Good question. We will have to take some time to think about it. But
Contribution, I mean.
Right, but it does tell you that one is relatively more informative than the other, right? I mean, to some degree, you're just disaggregating. You're pulling out pieces, right, of the same, there's, this information is sitting inside here. We're just disaggregating it. So should we expect significant overall explanatory power? I don't know. Should we expect, in a way, if you think about it, if you put these two together, what we're saying is both, we're forcing both the parent and the subsidiaries information to come in and be priced at sort of the same coefficient. And how binding that is, of a constraint is what would get you your incremental explanatory power, right? So, maybe it's not a huge binding constraint, but it still informs the market at a differential rate.
Yeah, I mean, my only point is that from my perspective, I mean, if I have an R-square of 13.2 or 13.3, it's really not a big deal at all. It's nothing really to talk about.
Again, I still think the individual pieces matter, right? I mean, you're not explaining. Well, maybe if I do this, it might help you think about it a little bit differently. All right. Let me say, one of the other tests that we've run.
So we have time limitation, so I'm gonna get 4 minutes uninterrupted, probably for say to finish.
To finish up. Okay, so let me share a couple of other pieces with you. One is simply that, meeting and beating earnings targets is a fairly common thing in the market. And what we're seeing is that essentially, if you meet or beat your earnings target and the source of the meet or beat is the parent, the market's reaction is higher. If you miss your earnings and the source of the miss is from the parent, the penalty is bigger, right? So that is something that we see there, and it kind of holds up in a multivariate setting. And so to the question of how much should we write home about the value of the disaggregated information, we look at it a slightly different way. Right. So we use sort of perfect foresight returns and ask what percentage of the total variation in market values would we be able to explain if we had perfect foresight of just the consolidated versus the consolidated and, the parent and the subsidiaries numbers. And what we do find is that you get, you explain substantially more of what's going on in a perfect foresight setting. Right. Okay. And then finally, I think, the place where we really see, what we think is sort of the most interesting part of the paper is that when there are, significant amounts of related party transactions that could be used either to expropriate or prop up, regardless of the type of related party transaction, you're seeing substantially more weight on the parent when you have relatively more of those present. We also see that in terms of both the number and size of the subsidiaries, that, as the number of subsidiaries grow up and as the size of them grows, your ability to do things like earnings managed through the subsidiaries grows. And so again, there's more reliance on the parent's earnings numbers. And then, similarly, we do that with accruals and discretionary accruals. And see that. So I think I'm pretty close to out of time. Thank you for all the comments, and I will stick around after the next paper is done so that we can certainly continue the discussion to the extent people want to. And I really, really appreciate everyone's thoughts.
Thank you very much, Sid. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So without further ado, let's welcome Patrick from Master. Yeah, you have a question. Yeah. Sorry, you can ask it. Sorry. That's a plot. Okay.
Right.
Okay, let's welcome
Patrick. I should stop sharing my screen so Patrick can share his. Hang on a sec.
Thank you. Thank you, Sid.
How do I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, so if you have the audience is have any further questions, just be free to send us an email or to the speaker as well if you have further questions. So let's welcome the second speaker from Patrick from Maastricht University. Patrick, would you mind sharing the screen to see if you can?
Can you see the slides?
Yes, perfect. Okay, the floor is yours, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Jung and Stephen, for giving us the opportunity to present our paper. It's joint work with Benjamin. He's also in the Zoom, so any questions, I'm sure Benjamin can also answer them, but I'm also happy to answer them. So what do we do? If you look at the FASB conceptual framework, sort of already gives an initial indication that disaggregations can be important. More or less, if you look at the quote, basically what it says is if we only report total assets, total liabilities, or total equity, that would not be very useful in terms of differentiating between companies, in terms of evaluating performance, and in terms of maybe predicting performance. So if you look at the conceptual frameworks, here it's of the FASB, but you see very similar things for the IASB. You already see a first indication that they want companies to disaggregate information. And that's also what we do. And in this case, we specifically focus on looking at how useful are disaggregations, in this case of the balance sheet. And the balance sheet provides a lot of useful information. You see the assets that the firm has, which can tell you something, for example, about the risks that are inherent in those assets. And in the end, if you think about it, these assets are also the assets that in the end should generate the revenues and that should generate the profits. So basically, what the balance sheet tells you is essentially all the assets that the firm have in place to generate those revenues and earnings. And in general, then you can sort of think of a change in assets as sort of a type of investment. If assets are going to go up, firms are investing in their productive capacity. And hopefully, if they do so efficiently, this should lead to a change in revenues and hopefully at some point also to a change in earnings. So we focus on the balance sheet because we think the balance sheet provides important information in this respect. And sort of then we look at how relevant are then disaggregations of the balance sheet. And if you look at the literature on the income statement, there is already a large literature on income statement disaggregations and a large literature that investigates which types of income statement disaggregations are more or less useful. And then you see like continuing operations income is more useful than sort of one-time items and things like that. So we sort of take a very similar perspective, but in this case, focus on the balance sheet. And I said before, if you look at what standard setters require, they basically require firms to disaggregate items on the balance sheet, depending on some key characteristics. And I said, what you can think of are things like risk. Some assets are inherently more risky than others. Some assets are reflective of different types of activities. If you think of tangibles versus intangibles, and assets can also differ in either how they are measured. If you think of historical cost versus fair value, and also the timing and way in which they are realized. If you think of current assets, which would generally be 1 year versus PPE, where you might essentially consume the benefits over a 20, 30, 40-year period. So more or less what we're then interested in is taking also the insights from this literature on the income statement. Well, we also see all these disaggregations of the balance sheet. And the key question then would be is how useful is disaggregating the balance sheet? And specifically in this case, then what we're going to look at is how useful is this for forecasting operating asset growth? So basically taking a financial statement analysis perspective and looking at one of the key things that investors might be interested in is forecasting, let's say, future performance. So what we're going to look at is how useful are these disaggregations then in forecasting future growth, which I said, hopefully, if assets are growing, should also come with a change in revenue. So we're also going to look at if we use these disaggregations for forecasting asset growth, what does it tell you also about the implications for future revenues? And then what we find is that, not maybe too surprisingly, but disaggregations are useful for forecasting. So if you use disaggregated forecasting models, they are more useful than forecasting asset growth based on an aggregate model, where you would just, let's say, predict, can I predict operating asset growth looking at mean reversion relative to lagged operating asset growth. However, from a forecasting perspective, it also seems that more disaggregation is not always better. And in our case, what we find for forecasting asset growth, the most accurate disaggregation in terms of forecasting would be disaggregating the balance sheet more or less in PPE, intangible assets, other non-current operating assets, and current operating assets. If you look at, well, is there any forecast improvement related to disaggregating current assets? We really do not find much. And in some cases, if you use disaggregated current assets, that actually leads to forecasts that are worse compared to just looking at total current assets. And in general, we find the same for disaggregating intangible assets. So in our main test, we have aggregated all the intangible assets, but you could argue things like goodwill are much different from maybe other types of intangibles that you see. However, on average, we do not find that this disaggregation is useful for forecasting, with one exception, and that's if you start to look at cases where maybe goodwill is most different from those other intangibles, which is for firms that are at risk of an impairment. It might be something relatively specific to goodwill, and it's usually something that can have a large impact on the value of goodwill. So for firms that are at risk of an impairment, in these cases, it is actually useful to disentangle between the components of intangibles and separately looking at goodwill and other intangibles. Now that's sort of the first part of the paper, where we look at, can we make more accurate forecasts of operating asset growth? And I said, using this level of disaggregation, we can. Sort of the second question then that we look at is, from that, can we also infer the revenue implications? And then are investors aware of these revenue implications? So basically, we take the disaggregated forecasts, and we're also going to use them to forecast growth in revenues. And then we see that if our disaggregated model predicts higher revenue growth relative to the aggregate model, you see that this is predictive of higher future stock returns. So sort of if the disaggregated forecasting model is more optimistic, you see sort of the same thing coming back in stock returns, where sort of the returns range between 6 to 6.2% in our regression analysis, and they go up to 7.5 to 9.5% if we use our hedge return tests. And sort of what we argue there is that, well, using disaggregations might be costly. So maybe some investors are not aware of these benefits of using these disaggregations. Sort of to substantiate those arguments, we look at several settings where, well, we think this might be informative there. So one of the things we find is that if you look at those stock returns, most of those stock returns are realized around the earnings announcement, which is sort of indicative of, well, it's at these earnings announcement maybe that investors learn that growth is actually better than expected. So you would also expect to see most of the returns around those earnings announcement days. Yes.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you. I'm just curious about the second. What's the story behind for the second finding that it seems that disaggregating current asset is not so useful compared. I mean, it's at first glance seems not so surprising because the current assets more temporarily versus those non-current ones, which are PPE, those kind of stuff, are more stable in terms of forecasting the future operating. It sounds not so surprising. I'm just curious, like what would be the reason behind the second finding?
I guess like we do find like separating current assets from non-current assets is very useful, which indeed should be the case if you think like, okay, yeah, these assets are very temporary. More or less what we thought about when disaggregating within current assets is, I mean, even there I also looked at different industries. So you could maybe argue that for like grocery stores, maybe inventory might be behaving very differently from accounts receivable or things like that. So there are maybe cases where you might expect that the assets within current assets actually behave maybe differently. But it does not seem the case that using those disaggregations, not even like for firms that differ substantially within these current assets, it does not seem that these disaggregations are useful.
Thank you. I think Ayan has a question, please.
Hi, Patrick. My question kind of related to what she asked is that for your second results, how much is that results just a reflective of the US economy has been migrating from manufacturing to more service intangible asset based, right? In terms of a usefulness, are we documenting the usefulness of reporting, or are we just documenting this migration in economic shift from 1990 to 2019?
So you mean like special? You mean like the disaggregation?
Manufacturing firms, you think about their more inventories, right? And then the new software companies have more unreported intangibles, and then the intangibles here, you only have to recognize intangibles, not in-house R&Ds, not human capital. So I suspect that most of the intangible assets here doesn't require disaggregation because the vast majority of the intangible assets are goodwill, right? So there's no need to actually separate out into goodwill versus other small fraction of the intangibles related to externally acquired. So the general question is that how do we interpret your second bullet point of a result? Is that something inform the usefulness of disaggregated balance sheet, or is it actually just to confirm or validate the US economy indeed has shifted from more inventory center manufacturing to more intellectual property based economy? Sorry for the hard question.
So like we do have a test where we look at the results sort of year by year. And I know like at least for the disaggregation we find to be most accurate, it sort of is very stable across years. So that was already in the early years, and it's the same in the later years. And the same like for the current asset disaggregation, it's really, it was to some extent a bit surprising that it was really sort of never useful, not for a particular industry. And also if you looked at years, there was not a single year where it really stood out, or you cannot really say like, okay, disaggregating current assets was useful in the early years, but not in the later years. I'm not sure like whether the same is true for the intangibles, because the disaggregation for intangibles is a bit, the sample is a lot smaller because yeah, maybe some firms do not have other intangibles or they do not report it. So there I only know the overall result, but it might also there maybe be interesting to check whether maybe in later years where, let's say if the sort of the investments in intangibles get a bit broader, maybe in later years, maybe in early years it was really all goodwill, and in later years there might be more other intangibles as well. So there it might be useful to see maybe whether this disaggregation is maybe more useful in later years if maybe the investments in intangibles are a bit more spread out.
Hi, Patrick. It's Pauline Lam here. I just have a quick question.
Yes.
For the asset, what if the companies do not report the loss in asset value, the impaired amount? And because the test that you have been doing is based on the reported numbers. So how would you detect the loss in asset value over time?
You mean specifically for goodwill or in general?
In general.
Sort of what we always
Because
say.
that will influence the forecast that you're doing for the predicted value of the asset. I mean, very often that company might not report fully about the loss in asset value.
So yeah, what we look at are the sort of the full balance sheet amounts, and at least like in essence, if you look at our asset categories that we look at, they are still pretty aggregated. So in terms of coverage and information reported, you really see it for most of the assets. And in that sense, we also do not really rely on any sort of in-between income statement information. So growth in PPE, for example, would be a joint effect of, well, they go down because of depreciation, they go maybe down because of some asset write-downs, and it might increase again because firms are investing in new PPE in the form of CapEx.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, what we look at is in the end balance sheet amounts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Let's see. Yeah, so I'll quickly already discuss the earnings announcement test. So the other thing that we look at to sort of investigate whether is this really maybe investors not utilizing the full extent of the balance sheet disaggregations. And for that, we look at institutional ownership, where the argument is that maybe institutional owners are better equipped to actually do this and to actually use disaggregated balance sheet information. And then you do see that most of these stock return results are concentrated in the low institutional ownership sample. And then if you look at types of institutions, you also see that's especially the split on transient institutional ownership that matters. Because it's usually those transient institutions that trade based on information, that maybe collect information and that might also actually do this. Versus if you split the sample based on dedicated sort of monitoring institutional ownership, you do not see such big results. And then finally, we also see that, well, if we are sort of predicting the revenue effects of our asset growth predictions, you also see this coming back in real revenue improvements. So basically, the firms for which we predict high asset growth, it looks like those were firms that were not doing too well today, but they are really catching up in the upcoming years. And in part, we also find that the return effects that we see are also driven by, if you use disaggregations, you can also incorporate that maybe $1 more of PPE has a different revenue effect than $1 more of intangibles or $1 more of current assets. And it also seems that incorporating this is partly responsible for the return results. Which we argue extends the literature on income statement disaggregation. So a lot of the literature on disaggregations has focused on the income statement, and in this case, we specifically look at the balance sheet. And then from an FSA perspective, it's sort of useful to see, can we actually use these disaggregations for improving our forecast for future growth? Which also seems to have some valuation implications if you look at our stock return results and maybe the extent to which investors are actually using this. And given that there are currently some discussions on, for example, current goodwill measurement model, to some extent, our analysis of disaggregating intangible assets into goodwill and maybe other intangibles can also provide some insight there, is at least given the current measurement model, does that warrant a disaggregation of goodwill versus other intangibles? And it seems that this would be the case if you think that, for example, goodwill is going to be heavily affected by impairments. As said, we try to forecast operating asset growth. So why do we focus on operating assets? Well, if you think of what are the underlying activities of firms that are supposed to generate revenues and profits, that's the operating assets and not so much the financial assets. And then maybe if you think of exceptions like Apple, for most of the firms, operating assets make up the vast majority of the balance sheet, which in our case, if you look at the medium firm, 90% of the assets on the balance sheet are operating assets, which is then, given that it's the primary driver of performance and firm value, also the most typically used metric in valuation studies. I said there is already some literature on disaggregations, and I said most of that literature is done on the income statement, where, for example, studies have looked at how useful are income disaggregations, for example, in improving future forecasts of ROE, where, for example, you can split earnings into continuing and non-continuing income. Yes.
Yeah, Patrick, Stephen Penman, you know, your forecast of operating asset growth, the notion there is, you know, look at the operating asset growth that's going to generate more earnings. It's sort of the traditional model of the firm. A number of modern firms get rid of their assets, okay? Apple's a very good example. It has hardly any, okay? It just gets rid of its assets, and so but it generates a lot of earnings still, and so its residual earnings increase tremendously. So you might want to think about distinguishing between those types of companies.
You mean like increasing in assets and decreases in assets?
No, I'm thinking of firms where the business model is, let me not do the manufacturing in the US, let me do it in Chengdu, okay? And get someone else to do the manufacturing. Let me do someone else do all the inventory and the component parts for the iPhone. I'm not going to have that on my balance sheet, okay? It's called the asset-less corporation in the modern jingo, okay? So, and that generates value because net operating assets actually use up value. You have to buy them. It's capex, and getting rid of capex is one way of actually generating value. So distinguishing those types of business models might improve your predictions.
Thank you.
I think Sudipta has a question. Sudipta, do you want to ask a question?
I'm just following up on Stephen's comment, just giving another example of a company that has outsourced its manufacturing.
But Ayan has a question.
Hi, Patrick.
Hi.
I think today you have like shorter time. You have like 23 minutes left, but I do have questions about the mean reverting process, because my understanding is that for us to actually come up with an estimate, it requires a long time series, right? So that's the part when I read a paper, I'm still not sure about how do you estimate, because so do you mind jumping to that estimation process? That's how you how you estimate that mean reverting process for each asset class?
Yeah, so
thank you.
At firm level, we do not require a lengthy time period. So it's sort of a cross-sectional estimation of the mean reversion sort of within groups. So I don't know, like if we make forecasts for, let's say, the year 2000, we estimate mean reversion from 1990 to 1999. But basically, an observation is in there if you have 2 years of data. So like any observation for which we can have at least one mean reversion estimate is in the sample. So you don't need to be in the sample for 10 years. It's a sort of economy-wide cross-sectional mean reverting regression using all available firms in the in-sample estimation period. And then we take those estimates and apply them for any observation that's available for our out-of-sample forecasting window. So sort of at firm level, there is no time requirement other than that you have lagged data that we can use to forecast performance, let's say, for this year.
And then a follow-up question, what's your scalar? So when you pull all the firms into a pool regression running it every 10 years, what's the scalar or deflator you use in order to pull firms together? Yeah.
So in this case, we would use just look at percentage growth rates.
Okay.
If it's the percentage of operating asset growth on the lagged percentage of operating asset growth, and if we do it at component level, it would be the same. And then sort of multiplying the expected growth rate with lagged values for either PPE or operating asset allows you to get to the new operating asset growth level. But then I said we do this then at the aggregate level to come up with the aggregate operating asset forecast. So for the aggregate model, we just run basically one regression of operating asset growth on lagged operating asset growth. But to get to the disaggregated forecast, we do that separately for each of the components. Let me actually continue here. So then these are the sort of the alternatives that we considered here in terms of what disaggregations might be useful for forecasting. So I said the aggregate benchmark model doesn't really disaggregate. We just look at overall operating assets. And sort of if you think of what would be the most natural disaggregation that you could think of in accounting, well, usually the balance sheet is split between current and non-current assets. So that's the first disaggregation that we look at. And then you can continue sort of by either disaggregating non-current assets, and that's what we do in PPE, intangibles, and others, or you can sort of disaggregate current operating assets into, in this case, we picked the more important ones, so inventory and accounts receivable, and then we had this group of other current assets. And then we also look at a model that sort of does both, so disaggregating both non-current assets and current assets, which we call the full disaggregated model. And then I said earlier, what we find to be the most accurate disaggregation, at least in our setting, is disaggregating non-current assets into PPE, intangibles, and other non-current assets. Then in terms of sample, so if you look at how useful are these forecasts, we estimate that over the period 2000 to 2019. But as I said earlier, we have a 10-year forecast window for the in-sample estimation. So basically the in-sample period starts from 1990. And then we apply some sort of traditional screens that should normally lead to better forecasts. So in the in-sample estimation, we drop the very extreme firms. So if you have more than 100% growth, you're out of the in-sample estimation. And for a similar reason, we require every component to be 1 million. Again, like if you keep all these very tiny components, that might lead to some extreme estimations in terms of mean reversion. And then we require less than 100% growth in operating assets, and we would do the same for each of the components. Where for the in-sample estimation, we apply the screens both on lagged data and contemporaneous data. For the out-of-sample period, we only apply those screens to the lagged data. So more or less the realization in year T does not play a role in whether you are in the out-of-sample sample. So for the out-of-sample estimation, we only looked at lagged components to avoid this look-ahead bias. And if you violate the sample screens on your lagged data, that's when you're out of our sample. Yes.
Hi, Patrick. So I understand that why you need to truncate your sample here, because your mean reverting model is kind of likely weight more towards smaller firms, right? Because your measure is a percentage, growth in percentage, and the smaller firms are likely to have a huge growth compared to a more mature firm. So your choice back then leads to your truncation choice here, because you don't want those firms kind of extrapolate all your estimated coefficient. I wonder you can go back to the mean reverting model and then kind of like we decided to actually, for example, weighted least square something, not putting so much weight on smaller firms. So later on, you don't need to actually remove all the smaller firms. Or firms actually are balance sheet light, based on what Stephen and Stupta talk about, then you actually have a better coverage, right? Because right now the forecasting model seem to kind of like using only certain firms who have a mature business and stable balance sheet growth in order to be incorporated in your model.
Yeah, something else I thought about and might be useful there is I remember some studies have done the same for accrual models, is maybe estimate them by size decile, where you would maybe say, okay, depending on the size of the firm, you might have actually differences in mean reversion. That might be something nice to look at. Then if you look at the end sample estimation, so in terms of operating asset growth, the sort of mean reversion or persistence we find is relatively similar to previous literature. So it's basically 0.2 of your growth this year is going to persist into next year. And then if you look at the components, you do see quite some differences across the asset components on your balance sheet. So relative to the overall growth in operating assets, you see that the growth in PPE is actually more persistent than the overall growth in operating assets. And maybe not surprisingly, given that current accruals reverse faster, the persistence of growth in accounts receivable is very low. And I said it's these mean reversion estimates that we then use to come up with either the aggregated operating asset growth forecast or the disaggregated operating asset growth forecast. Yes, there was a question.
So have you considered asymmetry in this mean reversion? So if you think back to Callahan and losses and my dissertation, you know that sort of negative things tend to reverse and positive things tend to continue.
Yeah, so we split it up, or we estimate another model where we sort of allowed mean reversion to differ depending on whether growth was positive or negative. I don't remember what it does to the forecast accuracy of the aggregate model. I don't think there was too much of a change, but we looked at it, and at least especially the difference between disaggregated versus aggregate models was sort of the same using these ones versus trying to split it on positive or negative growth. So then we decided to continue with this because it's the easier model than to implement. So we take these estimates then to come up with a forecast. And I said, like, for example, for the non-current DIS model, we would then take each of the components, which in that case would be current assets, and the three decompositions of non-current assets, and aggregate that into a new disaggregated operating asset growth forecast. And then to see which of these models are more accurate, sort of at firm level, in the end, the most important one would be the last one that we label here, forecast improvements, where we compare the forecast accuracy of the disaggregated forecast to the forecast accuracy of the disaggregated forecast. Let me quickly skip through this. And then sort of the first thing we do when evaluating the forecast accuracy is see whether at least already the aggregate model is more accurate than a random walk, which seems to be the case. So using the aggregate model is already beneficial from just saying, okay, growth is going to be equal to last year's growth. Disaggregating current and non-current assets at the mean does not seem to add a lot. But if you look at the median forecast improvements, they are not too big, but they are significantly positive. And then you also see that if you disaggregate then, so relative to only looking at current versus non-current assets, disaggregating current assets does not do much. And if anything, it actually makes forecasts worse relative to only using current and non-current assets. I said earlier, what we find is that the disaggregation of non-current assets seems to be the most beneficial, and that's also what you see here. So disaggregating non-current assets leads to forecasts that are more accurate relative to using no disaggregation, relative to disaggregating current and non-current assets, and then, given the earlier finding, also more accurate relative to disaggregating current assets. Yes.
Is that me? Yeah. You know, I'm thinking, the way I think I would do it, Patrick, is you think about generating future revenues and future earnings from the reviews, right? So one way I think I'd do it would be not just the net operating assets, but the net operating assets relative to sales, which is asset turnover, okay? So, and looking at the individual asset turnover. So what happens to the inventory turnover, the receivable turnover, property, plant, and equipment turnover? It would seem to me that would give you, and then of course you're controlling for the information already in the current revenues to predict. Now, so it's saying, look, I've got information on current revenues, but man, my inventory turnover ratio has gone to hell, or whatever. Okay, so I think that's the way I approach it. And the other thing I think I'd add is, in accounting, we know we tell ourselves you can't just look at the balance sheet without looking at the income statement. So looking at inventories to sales, PP&E to sales, you should also be looking at the operating income from sales. That's a profit margin. Okay, so in the question, therefore, does this disaggregation give you more information after controlling for the profit margin, the operating income relative to sales? That's profit margin. Then I think you have a sort of more holistic story about how the accounting works.
So yeah, we don't do that here. So like this would just be the for now, like the forecast improvements. Let me quickly jump ahead maybe a bit. When we go to the stock returns. So like the first thing sort of we do is we see, does this disaggregation lead to more accurate forecasts? And then I said one of the arguments would be that this is informative about future revenues. And one of the ways in which we approach is this informative for future revenues would be if we use our disaggregated model to forecast revenues, is this difference between disaggregated forecast and aggregate forecast, is this informative in this case for future stock returns? And in this test, we do sort of control for everything that should be available on the income statement. So we basically look at, so growth difference more or less captures what's the difference in revenue predictions from disaggregated forecast and aggregate forecast. But in this regression, we sort of control for, let's say, the very similar things on the income statement. So we control for lagged asset turnover and lagged profit margins. And sort of in the same way, we also try to control for, if you use disaggregated balance sheets, you can also use disaggregated income statements. So the last variable predicted FSY ROA is sort of the prediction you would get from disaggregated income statements using the most accurate income statement disaggregation from previous literature.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think this is the way to go. This is where you should set the thing up. Okay, I've got an income statement and a balance sheet, and I've really got to look at the two working together.
No, so we could for sure also do this already earlier in the forecasting, and maybe forecasting changes in asset turnover components. Yes.
Just a short question here. I mean, you have this growth difference, and I mean, how do you want to interpret this excess return? Basically, firms invest, they presumably have some positive NPV activities in their plans. But at the same time, you must recognize that this is, I thought you would say something of this kind, Stephen, this is growth at risk. So do you think that this excess return is compensation for growth at risk, or is it excess return in addition to the risk that you are taking?
I mean, I guess you never know 100% sure. So we try to do our best by sort of controlling for most of the risk factors that you see in prior literature. One of the other things that we do is our predictions associated with at least future changes in some of the observable risk variables. So we look at, if we predict higher growth, do you see that future idiosyncratic volatility goes down, or do you see changes in future betas? And we see that the growth difference is associated with future stock returns, but we do not find that there is any association with future changes in idiosyncratic volatility, or, for example, future changes in betas. So that's one thing we try to do. The other thing we try to do is...
Patrick, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks. So one of the other things that we try to do is then see, because we sort of argue that investors are not using this, can we find some cases where, if this is the case, this should be more likely? And one of the things we look at then is, are the returns concentrated around the earnings announcement? And sort of what we find is that this is the case. So we sort of redo the entire analysis and replace the annual buy and hold return with the either 3 to 5 day windows around the earnings announcement. And then we find that, you see the results here. Of course, the returns are smaller than the ones that we find over the entire year. But if you look at how much of the return is earned, so to say, around those earnings announcement days, you find that it's quite a lot. So we found returns that were ranging around 6%. And you sort of see that 24 to 31% of those returns are earned on the 4 earnings announcement in the year. Then taking that, those days, it's either 12 or 20 earnings announcement days, taking that they only make up 5 to 8% of the trading days, you see that sort of earnings announcement days are a factor 4 to 5 times more important in explaining the returns to growth difference. And so that's one way in which we sort of try to go to, is there an indication that investors are not using this? Which you would likely see at the earnings announcement, because it's at these dates that then investors should see that growth is indeed, let's say, higher than what was expected. So one other thing that we look at is institutional ownership. And again, the argument would be is that mainly less sophisticated investors would not use this information, which is what you see if you do the split on institutional ownership. So the trading returns are concentrated in the low institutional ownership sample. And then you see if you split on types of ownership, it's especially transient ownership that matters, which would be consistent here, given that these are usually the ones that trade based on, let's say, maybe accounting information. In any case, generally more so than dedicated institutions. And you also see that splitting on dedicated institutional ownership does less here. And then finally, one other thing that we look at is, do you really see any improvements? And I said before, what seems to happen is that in general, disaggregated models tend to forecast lower growth levels, which I sort of skipped on that in the beginning. It sort of makes these models less biased. What you see here then is that if we predict higher growth, it's sort of also associated with increased future performance. And it seems that these firms are maybe not performing too well now, but they are improvements in return on assets, sales growth, and then sort of fitting with the earlier discussion, also changes in asset turnover. And it seems to be less informative about changes in profit margin, which again, we see as something consistent in terms of you use these assets to generate sales, and it's maybe especially the efficiency here that's mattering for the future performance effects. And then one final thing that we do is, if you think of we forecast revenues using disaggregated models, differences can come from differences in growth predictions, where the aggregate model might predict less growth than a disaggregate model or the other way around. Or if you use disaggregated models, you can also incorporate whether revenues grow equally given the different asset components. So maybe €1 of receivables is different from $1 of PPE. If we look at the returns, it seems that both components matter. So differences in asset growth seem to be associated with future returns, but also if you use a disaggregated model, you can incorporate the asset-specific revenue generating ability. And it's also this component that seems to matter for the future stock returns. Which then quickly to conclude, we find that disaggregated models are useful, but more is not always better. So it seems that disaggregating non-current assets seems to be the most useful thing. And as I said, we do see that these returns seem to be associated with future returns. And then I would say, thanks for all the comments.
Thank you.
Do you have a slide for the next event?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for today's participation. So don't forget, we're going to have the third session, next session on October 17th. Please register if you are interested in. And thank you very much for all participation. Thank you.